The January wind bit through the thin fabric of Elijah's jacket as he stood outside the grand double doors of Westfield Music Academy. The imposing stone building loomed over him, its windows glowing with warm light that seemed to mock the cold reality of his situation. Beside him, Ms. Rivera checked her watch for the third time in 5 minutes, her breath forming small clouds in the frosty air. "Remember what we talked about," she said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Just do your best. That's all anyone can ask." Elijah nodded, though his stomach twisted with nerves. He knew what people saw when they looked at him. A skinny kid with clothes that hadn't been washed in too long, hair that stuck up in odd places, and the lingering smell that came from living in a shelter with 50 other people and only 2 working showers. "Maybe this isn't a good idea," he mumbled, staring down at his worn-out sneakers. Ms. Rivera squeezed his shoulder. "It took me 3 weeks of phone calls to get you this audition. 5 minutes of your playing is all they need to hear." The conviction in her voice almost made him believe it was possible. With a deep breath that did little to steady his nerves, Elijah followed her through the doors and into a world he'd only seen in movies. The entrance hall sparkled with crystal chandeliers, and the polished marble floor reflected their images like a mirror. People in fancy clothes stood in small groups, laughing and talking, champagne glasses glinting in the light. The conversations nearest to them faltered as heads turned. Elijah felt the familiar weight of judgment settling over him, pressing down on his shoulders until he wanted to disappear. A woman in a blue dress wrinkled her nose and stepped away as they passed. "The recital is by invitation only," said a tall man with silver hair, materializing in front of them with a clipboard. His eyes passed over Elijah with the quick assessment of someone cataloging flaws. "We have an appointment with Dr. Hargrove," Ms. Rivera said, pulling a folded paper from her bag. "Elijah Thomas for a special audition." The man's eyebrows rose as he scanned the paper. "Ah, yes, follow me, please," his voice carried, a note of doubt that Elijah had heard countless times before. They followed him down a long hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women seated at pianos or holding violins. Each frame seemed to watch Elijah pass with disapproval, as if he were tracking mud on their perfect legacy. The man stopped at a door and knocked twice before opening it. "Dr. Hargrove, the special appointment has arrived." Inside the room, a woman with sharp features and even sharper eyes looked up from her desk. Her gaze landed on Elijah, and he could see the moment she registered his appearance. The slight widening of her eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening of her lips. "Ms. Rivera, I presume?" Dr. Hargrove stood, extending her hand to the social worker while keeping a careful distance from Elijah. "And this must be the young man you've told me so much about." "Yes, this is Elijah," Ms. Rivera said, her voice warm with pride that made Elijah's cheeks burn. "Thank you for making time for us today." Dr. Hargrove nodded, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "The recital begins in 30 minutes. All of our scheduled performers are children who have been studying at Westfield for years. Their parents are important donors and community members." Her gaze finally settled on Elijah. "I must be frank, your request is highly unusual." "I understand," Ms. Rivera said. "But I promise you won't regret giving him a chance." Dr. Hargrove sighed. "Very well. He can play after intermission. 5 minutes, no more." "Thank you," Ms. Rivera said, squeezing Elijah's shoulder again. Dr. Hargrove led them to the recital hall, a grand room with rows of cushioned seats facing a stage where a gleaming black piano waited in the spotlight. The room was already half filled with people in expensive clothes, their jewelry catching the light as they moved. "Wait here," Dr. Hargrove instructed, pointing to 2 empty seats in the back corner. "I'll call you when it's time." As she walked away, Elijah sank into the seat, trying to make himself as small as possible. He could feel people staring, could hear the whispers starting around them like a breeze rippling through tall grass. Who is that child? Is he performing? Surely not. What's that smell? The last comment made Elijah hunch further into himself. He'd scrubbed his hands and face in the shelter's bathroom before leaving, but he knew it wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough. "Ignore them," Ms. Rivera whispered, but her eyes were sad. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the crowd as Dr. Hargrove took the stage. "Welcome to Westfield Music Academy's winter recital," she announced, her voice polished and confident. "Tonight, we celebrate the extraordinary talent of our students, who represent the future of classical music in America. One by one, Children around Elijah's age took the stage. Boys in press suits and girls in fancy dresses, all of them moving with the easy confidence of people who had never been told they didn't belong. They played complex pieces on violins, cellos, and the piano, their fingers dancing across the instruments with practiced precision. The crowd applauded enthusiastically after each performance, proud parents beaming at their gifted children. Elijah watched with a mixture of awe and longing. He'd never had lessons, had taught himself to play on a battered keyboard donated to the shelter 2 years ago. Ms. Rivera had heard him playing late one night when everyone else was asleep, and she'd been trying to help him ever since. During intermission, people stood to stretch their legs and chat. The whispers about Elijah grew louder as a woman in a red dress approached Dr. Hargrove, gesturing in their direction with obvious displeasure. "This is a prestigious event," the woman said, her voice carrying across the room. "We have standards to maintain." Dr. Hargrove nodded, her expression troubled as she glanced toward Elijah. She made her way through the crowd, stopping to speak with a round-faced man in an expensive suit who seemed to be in charge. "I think there might be a problem," Ms. Rivera murmured, watching the exchange with growing concern. The man in the suit frowned deeply, then made his way over to them with Dr. Hargrove trailing behind, looking uncomfortable. "I understand you're here for an audition," he said, addressing Ms. Rivera while pointedly avoiding looking at Elijah. "But I'm afraid we must ask you to leave." "What? Why?" Ms. Rivera stood up, her voice sharp with indignation. "You agreed to give him a chance." The man cleared his throat. "Several parents have complained. This is a formal event, and there are certain expectations regarding presentation and—" He paused, searching for a delicate way to phrase it. "Personal hygiene." Elijah felt his face burning with shame. He'd heard worse, much worse, but it never stopped hurting. "He's just a child," Miss Rivera said, her voice rising. "A child with an extraordinary gift. I'm sure he's very talented," the man said dismissively. "But this isn't the appropriate venue. Perhaps another time when there's been proper preparation." A small crowd had gathered now, watching the scene unfold with curious eyes. Elijah could hear someone whispering loudly, not bothering to hide their words. "Get that kid out. He smells." Tears pricked at Elijah's eyes, but he blinked them back fiercely. Crying would only make things worse, would only confirm what they already thought, that he didn't belong here, that he was something to be pitied or scorned. "We're not leaving," Ms. Rivera said firmly, though Elijah could hear the slight tremor in her voice. "Elijah deserves his 5 minutes, just like every other child here tonight." The man's face hardened. "I'm afraid I must insist. Is there a problem here?" A new voice joined the conversation. A tall, thin man with kind eyes and a bow tie that seemed slightly crooked against his crisp white shirt. "Professor Chen," Dr. Hargrove said, sounding relieved. "There's been a misunderstanding. These guests were just leaving." Professor Chen studied Elijah with curious eyes. "Are you the young man Ms. Rivera called about? The one who taught himself to play?" Elijah nodded, not trusting his voice. "I'd very much like to hear you play," Professor Chen said, smiling at him. "I've spent my life looking for raw talent, and it's becoming increasingly rare in this age of polished performances." "Professor, several parents have complained," Dr. Hargrove began, but Professor Chen waved her concerns away. "Music doesn't care about clean clothes or social status. Dr. Hargrove, it never has." He turned to Elijah. "What will you play for us today?" "Chopin," Elijah whispered. "And something I wrote?" Professor Chen's eyebrows shot up. "Original composition as well?" Now I'm truly intrigued. He turned to the man in the suit. "Richard, surely we can spare 5 minutes for something potentially extraordinary?" Richard hesitated, looking around at the watching crowd. "Very well," he said finally. "But after the scheduled performers." "Thank you," Ms. Rivera said, relief evident in her voice. As the crowd dispersed, Professor Chen gave Elijah an encouraging nod. "Don't mind them," he said quietly. "Most people are afraid of anything different, anything that challenges their neat categories. Show them why they're wrong." With those words, he walked away, leaving Elijah with a strange feeling growing in his chest, something that felt almost like hope. The second half of the recital began with polite applause as a small girl in a pink dress took the stage. Her fingers danced across the piano keys, playing a piece by Mozart with practiced precision. Elijah watched her carefully, noting the way she held her wrists, the slight pause between movements. She was good, very good. But he could hear the places where technique replaced feeling, where she played the notes without understanding the heart behind them. Ms. Rivera patted his hand. "Are you nervous?" she whispered. Elijah nodded, his stomach twisting into knots. He was always nervous before playing, but this was different. Usually he played alone in the shelter's common room, or sometimes for the younger kids when they couldn't sleep. The keyboard there had 3 broken keys and made a buzzing sound when he pressed the pedal, but it was still the most wonderful thing he'd ever touched. This gleaming grand piano waiting on stage was like comparing a puddle to the ocean. As each student performed, Elijah's anxiety grew. These kids had been taking lessons for years. They had teachers and practice rooms and parents who drove them to recitals. What was he thinking? Believing he could play among them. "I can't do this," he whispered to Ms. Rivera. "Yes, you can," she replied firmly. "You have something special, Elijah. Something that can't be taught." Before he could respond, he noticed Dr. Hargrove and Richard, the man in the expensive suit, huddled together in deep conversation. They kept glancing in his direction, their expressions grim. A moment later, they were joined by the woman in the red dress and another man wearing a bow tie that matched his pocket square. "I don't like the look of that," Ms. Rivera murmured, following his gaze. The group broke apart, and Dr. Hargrove approached them with quick, determined steps. Her smile was tight as she leaned down to speak in a hushed voice. "I'm afraid there's been a change of plans," she said. "The program is running longer than expected, and we simply don't have time for additional performers." Ms. Rivera straightened in her seat. "That's not fair. You promised him 5 minutes. "Perhaps another time," Dr. Hargrove said, not meeting their eyes. "We host community events twice a year that might be more appropriate." Elijah felt something cold and heavy settle in his chest. He recognized the lie for what it was. A polite way of saying he didn't belong here, that they had no interest in hearing him play. "This isn't about time," Ms. Rivera said, her voice rising slightly. "This is about not wanting to give him a chance because of how he looks." Dr. Hargrove's lips pressed into a thin line. "Please keep your voice down. We have an audience to consider." "Yes, heaven forbid they witness some actual compassion," Ms. Rivera shot back. A few heads turned in their direction, curious eyes taking in the scene. Elijah wished he could disappear through the floor. This was exactly what he'd been afraid of. Becoming a spectacle. A problem to be solved. "We'll go," he said quietly, tugging at Ms. Rivera's sleeve. "It's okay." "It is not okay," she insisted, but her eyes softened as she looked at him. "But if you want to leave, we'll leave." As they gathered their things, Professor Chen appeared beside them, his brow furrowed in concern. "You're not leaving, are you? I was looking forward to hearing you play." "Apparently there's no time in the program," Ms. Rivera explained, her voice tight with anger. Professor Chen frowned. "That's strange. The program always includes a 10-minute break before the final performance." He looked directly at Elijah. "Would you still like to play?" Hope flickered in Elijah's chest, but as he opened his mouth to respond, Richard appeared at Dr. Hargrove's side. "There's been a complaint," he announced, not bothering to lower his voice. "Several parents have expressed concern about having an unprepared performer disrupt the program." "Unprepared?" Professor Chen repeated, his eyebrows shooting up. "Have you heard him play, Richard?" "That's not the point," Richard said stiffly. "This is a formal event. There are standards to maintain." "Ah, yes. Standards." Professor Chen's voice took on an edge Elijah hadn't heard before. "Like judging a musician by their appearance rather than their talent? Those kinds of standards?" Richard's face flushed. "Now see here." "No, you see here," Professor Chen interrupted. 50 years ago they wouldn't let me play in halls like this either. Wrong skin color, wrong background. And yet here I stand, on your board of directors." He turned to Elijah. "Sometimes you have to play so well they can't ignore you." The standoff was interrupted by a commotion near the front of the hall. The woman in the red dress was speaking loudly to a group of parents, gesturing toward Elijah with obvious disgust. "It's not just inappropriate, it's unsanitary," she declared. "The smell alone is enough to ruin the evening. Get that kid out. He smells." The words carried across the hall, landing like physical blows. Elijah felt his face burn with shame, felt the curious stares of strangers assessing him, judging him. This was worse than anything he'd imagined. Worse than the taunts from kids at school or the whispers of shelter volunteers who thought he couldn't hear them. Ms. Rivera stepped forward, fury in every line of her body. "How dare you speak about a child that way?" "This isn't helping," Elijah whispered, pulling at her arm. "Please, can we just go?" But the damage was done. People were staring openly now, the recital forgotten as the drama unfolded. Dr. Hargrove looked torn between embarrassment and irritation as she tried to calm the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, please," she called out. "Let's remember where we are." "I know exactly where we are," the woman in red retorted. "At an exclusive event being disrupted by someone who clearly doesn't belong here." Professor Chen stepped into the center of the hall, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Is this what we're teaching our students? That music belongs only to those who can afford expensive clothes and private lessons? That talent is less important than appearance?" A heavy silence fell over the room. Elijah wanted to run, to hide from all these eyes, but something kept him rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the way Professor Chen stood there, unashamed and unafraid. Maybe it was Ms. Rivera's hand on his shoulder, steady and warm. Or maybe it was something deeper, a voice inside him that had been whispering since the first time he touched a piano. "This is where you belong." Dr. Hargrove cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should let the boy play," she suggested, clearly hoping to end the scene. 5 minutes, as agreed. "He doesn't need your charity," Ms. Rivera said coldly. "It's not charity I'm offering," Dr. Hargrove replied. "It's an opportunity to prove Professor Chen right." She turned to Elijah. "Well, will you play for us?" All eyes turned to him, waiting. Elijah felt dizzy with the attention, with the weight of the moment. Part of him wanted to refuse, to walk, away from these people who had judged him before hearing a single note. But another part, the part that stayed up late practicing on the shelter's broken keyboard, that part yearned for the chance to touch that gleaming piano on stage. "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll play." Professor Chen smiled, a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Excellent decision." As they made their way toward the stage, the whispers followed them like shadows. "This should be interesting." Poor Dr. Hargrove, caught in an impossible situation. 5 minutes, then we can all go home. The grand piano seemed to grow larger as Elijah approached it, its polished surface reflecting the stage lights. He'd never played on anything like this before, had only seen such instruments in videos or through the windows of music stores he'd never dared to enter. Ms. Rivera squeezed his shoulder one last time. "Remember what I told you," she said softly. "Just be yourself. That's more than enough." Elijah nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat. As he climbed the steps to the stage, he could feel the weight of all those doubtful stares, could almost taste the low expectations in the air. They were waiting for him to fail, waiting to be proven right about the smelly kid who didn't belong. The bench felt cool and smooth beneath him as he sat down. The keys stretched before him like a road, familiar yet strange. He placed his hands in his lap, trying to steady their trembling. In the front row, the woman in red whispered something to her companion, both of them smirking behind manicured hands. A few rows back, Richard checked his watch pointedly. Elijah closed his eyes, shutting them all out. He thought of the shelter. At night, of the quiet hours when everyone else was asleep and the keyboard was finally his alone. He thought of the music that lived inside him, the melodies that came to him in dreams and followed him through waking hours. He placed his fingers on the keys, and he began to play. The first note hung in the air like a drop of water before falling. Then another followed and another, until they weren't separate sounds anymore but a flowing air of music. Elijah's fingers moved across the keys with a lightness that belied the heaviness in his heart just moments before. He had chosen Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece that spoke of night skies and whispered dreams. It was the first classical piece he'd taught himself, painstakingly picking out the melody on the shelter's keyboard while watching tutorial videos on the ancient community computer. He'd practiced it until his fingers ached, until he could play it with his eyes closed, feeling each note rather than seeing it. The piano responded to his touch differently than he expected. The keys were smoother, more responsive than the clunky keyboard he was used to. Each note rang out with crystal clarity, filling the hall with sound that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his small, undernourished body. Someone gasped in the audience. Elijah didn't open his eyes to see who. He was somewhere else now, somewhere the whispers and stares couldn't reach him. The music carried him away from the hunger that gnawed at his stomach most days, away from the shelter cots lined up in rows, away from the smell that clung to his clothes no matter how hard he tried to wash them in the bathroom sink. His left hand rolled through an arpeggio while his right picked out the delicate melody above it. The piece demanded both technical skill and emotional depth, and Elijah gave it everything he had. Each phrase told a story, of longing, of beauty glimpsed from afar, of hope that refused to die even in darkness. As he reached the middle section, where the music grew more complex and intense, he leaned into the piano as if embracing an old friend. His small frame swayed with the rhythm, completely surrendered to the music flowing through him. In the audience, something shifted. The whispers had stopped. The shuffling of programs, the discreet coughs, the subtle checking of watches, all silent now. Even the woman in the red dress sat perfectly still, her earlier disgust replaced by something that looked almost like wonder. Professor Chen stood at the side of the stage, one hand pressed to his mouth, eyes wide with recognition of what he was witnessing. Dr. Hargrove's clipboard hung forgotten at her side. Her professional mask slipped just enough to reveal genuine surprise. And Ms. Rivera, sitting in the back row where they'd been relegated, wept silently, tears streaming down her face as she watched the boy she'd fought for finally being seen, truly seen, for who he was beyond the circumstances life had thrust upon him. As the nocturne approached its conclusion, Elijah allowed the notes to linger, stretching time itself with each delicate phrase. The final chords faded into a silence so complete you could hear the winter wind whistling outside the building. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. No one breathed. Then, without opening his eyes, Elijah began to play again. But this time, it wasn't Chopin's notes flowing from his fingers. It was his own composition, something born from late nights in the shelter when sleep wouldn't come, when the pain of his mother's absence and the uncertainty of his future pressed down on him like a physical weight. The piece began softly, hesitantly, like someone testing ice to see if it would hold their weight. Simple chords in a minor key, speaking of loss and loneliness. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, something changed. A major chord appeared, bringing with it a shaft of light. The tempo quickened slightly, the melody becoming more confident, more hopeful. It was the sound of survival, the sound of a boy who had every reason to give up but chose to go on living anyway. In the front row, a handkerchief appeared in the hand of a gray-haired man who had earlier looked at Elijah with thinly veiled contempt. Now he dabbed discreetly at his eyes, his face softened by something that might have been shame. Richard, the man in the expensive suit, stood motionless by the door, his earlier impatience forgotten. His eyes never left Elijah's hands as they coaxed this unexpected beauty from the instrument he'd almost been prevented from touching. Elijah's composition built to a climax that spoke of determination, of strength found in broken places. His left hand thundered in the bass while his right spun out a melody that soared above the harmonic foundation like a bird rising on a thermal. It was joyful without being naive, complex without being pretentious, music that acknowledged pain but refused to be defined by it. As he played the final section, Elijah finally opened his eyes. What he saw nearly made him stumble over the keys. The entire audience was completely still, many of them leaning forward in their seats as if drawn by an invisible force. Some faces were wet with tears, others showed expressions of pure astonishment. Everyone in that room was holding their breath. The realization made his heart race, but his fingers never faltered. He had lived inside music too long to be distracted now, even by the miracle of being truly heard. He brought the piece to its conclusion with a series of chords that resolved the tension without erasing it completely, because that was the truth of his life. Not a fairy tale ending, but a hard-won piece that carried the memory of struggle within it. The final note faded away, but Elijah kept his finger on the key, unwilling to break the spell. When he finally lifted his hands from the piano, the silence lasted for one more breath. Then the hall erupted. The applause began somewhere in the back and spread like wildfire. People rose to their feet, their faces transformed by what they had just witnessed. They clapped until their hands hurt, as if trying to express something that went beyond words, beyond social barriers, beyond prejudice. Elijah sat very still on the bench, overwhelmed by the response. This wasn't polite applause, this wasn't charity. This was recognition. Professor Chen was the first to reach him, climbing the steps to the stage with tears unashamedly streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Young man," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "where on earth did you learn to play like that?" Elijah shrugged, suddenly shy again now that the music had stopped. "I just hear it in my head." "That composition, did you really write that yourself?" Professor Chen asked, still incredulous despite having heard it with his own ears. Elijah nodded. "I don't know how to write it down properly, I just remember how it goes." By now, Dr. Hargrove had joined them on stage, her earlier coldness replaced by an expression of professional interest tinged with shame. "How long have you been playing?" she asked. 2 years, Elijah said softly, "since the shelter got the keyboard." Dr. Hargrove's eyes widened. 2 years? Without formal lessons? "He's entirely self-taught," Ms. Rivera explained as she made her way to the stage, pride evident in every word. "He watches videos online when he can get computer time at the library. The rest he figures out by ear." "Extraordinary," Dr. Hargrove murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. Simply extraordinary. The audience was still applauding, still standing. Among them, the woman in the red dress who had been so vocal about removing Elijah clapped mechanically, her face a complex mixture of emotions. Beside her, her companion whispered something in her ear, but she shook her head sharply, unable or unwilling to respond. Professor Chen turned to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying easily through the hall, "I believe we have just witnessed something truly remarkable. A reminder that talent knows no social boundaries, that genius can emerge from the most unlikely places." The applause grew louder, punctuated now by calls of "bravo" and "encore." Elijah looked out at the sea of faces, all focused on him with expressions so different from the ones they'd worn just 10 minutes earlier. It was hard to believe these were the same people who had wanted him removed, who had complained about his smell, who had judged him before hearing a single note. Now they were calling for more. Ms. Rivera bent down to whisper in his ear. "You did it, Elijah. You showed them." He nodded, still too overwhelmed to speak. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about the future or what might come of this unexpected triumph. He wasn't thinking about the years of struggle behind him, or the challenges that still lay ahead. He was thinking about his mom, who had loved music and had sung to him every night before she got sick, who had told him once that music was a doorway to a world where nothing else mattered. Not money, not clothes, not where you came from or what you looked like. Only what was in your heart, and whether you were brave enough to share it. After 3 curtain calls, the audience finally settled back into their seats, a buzz of excited conversation filling the hall. Elijah remained at the piano, unsure of what to do next. His 5 minutes had stretched to 15, and the scheduled program had been completely forgotten. Professor Chen motioned for him to stay seated. "Would you play something else for us?" he asked, his voice gentle but eager. "Perhaps another original piece?" Elijah hesitated, suddenly aware of all the expectant faces. This moment felt like a dream, too fragile to trust. "I have one more," he admitted, "but it's not finished yet." "We'd be honored to hear it, finished or not," Professor Chen said. So Elijah played again. This piece was newer, still taking shape in his mind. It had come to him in fragments over the past few weeks, during the long bus rides between shelters and government offices, as his caseworker tried to find him a more permanent placement. The music spoke of uncertainty, but also of unexpected beauty found in transient moments. Sunshine through a bus window, a kind word from a stranger, the perfect harmony of raindrops on a metal roof. When he finished, the applause was just as enthusiastic as before. Dr. Hargrove stepped forward, her professional demeanor now tempered with genuine respect. "Mr. Thomas," she said, addressing him with a formality that no adult had ever used with him before, "I believe we need to have a serious conversation about your future." Before she could continue, there was a commotion at the back of the hall. The door had opened, admitting a blast of cold air and a tall, thin man in a rumpled overcoat. He scanned the room with sharp eyes, then made his way down the center aisle. "Please forgive my lateness," he called out. "Car trouble? Did I miss anything interesting?" "Just the discovery of the decade, Oliver," Professor Chen replied with a smile. "You have impeccable timing as always." The newcomer raised an eyebrow as he approached the stage. "Oh, do tell. Better yet, we'll show you." Professor Chen turned to Elijah. "One more piece, if you wouldn't mind. Perhaps the Chopin again? Oliver Bryant is our head of scholarship programs and the finest piano instructor on the East Coast." Elijah nodded, nervous but also strangely calm. He was beyond fear now, floating in a new reality where people actually wanted to hear him play. He returned to the nocturne, but this time he played it differently, with more confidence, more personal interpretation. The piece had always reminded him of starlight, so he let that image guide his fingers, creating a sound that sparkled and shimmered. Oliver Bryant stood motionless by the stage, his expression shifting from polite interest to intense focus and finally, to unconcealed amazement. When the last note faded, he didn't applaud. Instead, he climbed the steps to the stage and approached the piano with the reverence of someone entering a sacred space. "How old are you?" he asked Elijah. 12. "And your training?" "I don't have any." "Not really." Oliver exchanged a look with Professor Chen that contained volumes of unspoken communication. Then he turned back to Elijah. "Play a C major scale for me, please." 2 octaves, Elijah complied, his fingers moving up and down the keys in the most basic of musical exercises. Now G minor, harmonic form. Again, Elijah played without hesitation, chromatic scale starting on F sharp. As Elijah executed each request perfectly, the furrow between Oliver's eyebrows deepened. He leaned closer to the keyboard, watching Elijah's hands with an intensity that would have been unnerving if Elijah hadn't been so focused on the task. "Your technique is unorthodox," Oliver said finally, "but your ear is impeccable. And your musicality." He trailed off, shaking his head in wonder. "Where did you learn to play like this?" Elijah shrugged, uncomfortable with the question he couldn't really answer. "I just listened and practiced." "On what instrument?" "There's a keyboard at the shelter. Some of the keys don't work anymore, and the pedal makes a buzzing sound, but it's better than nothing." A painful silence followed this simple statement. Even those in the audience who had been the most judgmental earlier now looked stricken, imagining this child coaxing such beauty from a broken instrument in a homeless shelter. The woman in the red dress suddenly stood up. "I have a spare piano," she announced, her voice loud in the quiet hall. "A baby grand. It's just sitting in my summer house collecting dust." She looked directly at Elijah, her earlier disgust replaced by determination. It should be played by someone with talent. This unexpected offer broke the dam. Suddenly everyone was talking at once, offering resources, suggestions, support. "My brother is a lawyer," called out a man in the third row. "He could help with guardianship issues." "The community music school has emergency housing for students," added a woman near the front. "My daughter stayed there during the flood last year." "I have connections at Juilliard," said another voice. "For when he's ready." Dr. Hargrove raised her hands, calling for quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen, your generosity is appreciated, but we need to proceed carefully. Elijah is a minor under state care." She turned to Ms. Rivera. "I assume there are procedures that must be followed?" Ms. Rivera nodded, looking slightly dazed by the turn of events. "Yes, but..." She glanced at Elijah, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "This is exactly what I've been hoping for. Someone to see what I see in him." Professor Chen cleared his throat. "I believe we can start with a full scholarship to Westfield's weekend program." That requires no change in Elijah's living situation, but would give him access to proper instruction and instruments immediately. And private lessons with me, Oliver added without hesitation. Twice weekly to begin with. Dr. Hargrove nodded crisply, her clipboard reappearing as she made notes. We'll need to arrange transportation, of course, and proper attire for performances. I can help with that, offered a quiet voice from the back. A middle-aged woman in a simple black dress stepped forward. My son grew out of his performance clothes and they're just sitting in a closet. As the offers continued, Elijah sat very still on the piano bench, trying to process what was happening. 10 minutes ago, these same people had wanted him removed from the building. Now they were falling over themselves to help him. The whiplash of it made him dizzy. He caught Ms. Rivera's eye and she came to stand beside him, a steadying presence amid the storm of sudden attention. Are you okay? She asked softly. I don't understand, he whispered back. Why do they care now? Nothing about me has changed. Ms. Rivera squeezed his shoulder. They heard you, really heard you. Sometimes that's all it takes, the right moment for someone to actually pay attention. Professor Chen overheard this exchange and stepped closer. She's right, you know. Music has always had the power to break down barriers, to make people see beyond the surface. His eyes were kind as he looked at Elijah. But don't think for a moment that you didn't earn this. What we heard today wasn't luck or charity. It was excellence, pure and simple. Oliver Bryant nodded in agreement. I've been teaching for 30 years and I've never heard a completely untrained player with your level of natural musicality. Never. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. The technique we can teach. The theory, the history, the formal structures, all of that can be learned. But what you have, he shook his head in wonder. That's something else entirely. As the adults continued to make plans around him, Elijah's fingers returned to the keys, not playing exactly, just feeling their cool smoothness beneath his fingertips. For 2 years, the broken keyboard at the shelter had been his only escape. His private world where none of the hardships of his life could follow. He had never imagined that it might also be his way out. Dr. Hargrove was now in full organizational mode, her earlier prejudice apparently forgotten as she assigned tasks and made lists. We'll need to fast-track the paperwork, she was saying to Ms. Rivera, and arrange for an official audition for the full scholarship committee. Though after tonight, that's merely a formality. The woman in the red dress approached the stage, her earlier haughtiness replaced by an almost apologetic demeanor. About the piano, she said, addressing both Elijah and Ms. Rivera. I was serious. It needs a good home and clearly it would be appreciated. She hesitated, then added more quietly, and I'm sorry about what I said earlier. It was unforgivable. Ms. Rivera's expression remained cool. It's not me you should be apologizing to. The woman nodded and turned to Elijah. I judged you unfairly, she said simply. I was wrong. I hope you can forgive me. Elijah looked at her, seeing past the expensive clothes and perfectly styled hair to the discomfort in her eyes. He thought about forgiveness, about how his mother had always told him that carrying anger was like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. I forgive you, he said softly, and he meant it. Something in the woman's face relaxed, a tension releasing. Thank you, she said, and there was genuine gratitude in her voice. As the evening wound down, plans were made for Elijah to return the following week for a formal assessment and to begin lessons. Ms. Rivera handled the logistics with practiced efficiency, though Elijah could see the barely contained excitement in her eyes. We should go, she said finally, checking her watch. The shelter has curfew and we've already missed dinner. Oh, that won't do, said Professor Chen. Let's get you both a proper meal before you head back. My treat. As they gathered their things to leave, Elijah took one last look at the grand piano on the stage. Just hours ago, it had seemed like an impossible dream. Now it was a promise, a glimpse of a future he had never dared to imagine for himself. Thank you, he said to the instrument, too quietly for anyone else to hear. I'll be back soon. 6 months passed like the turning pages of a book, each day bringing new challenges, new triumphs, new music. Spring arrived, painting the city with colors that seemed brighter somehow, as if Elijah's world had shifted from black and white into full spectrum. The changes in his life had been swift and profound. 3 weeks after his performance at Westfield, he had moved out of the shelter and into a foster home with the Wilsons. a kind older couple who had worked with the music academy for years. Mr. Wilson had been a jazz saxophonist in his youth, and the small house resonated with music at all hours. For the first time since his mother's death, Elijah slept in the same bed every night, ate regular meals at a kitchen table, and didn't have to guard his few possessions with constant vigilance. Most importantly, he had the piano, the baby grand that the woman in the red dress, Mrs. Abernathy, he now knew, had donated. It sat in the Wilsons' front room, its polished surface catching the morning light that streamed through lace curtains. Elijah practiced for hours each day, his fingers growing stronger, more precise. The calluses he had developed on the shelter's keyboard were replaced by new ones, badges of honor earned through dedicated work. On a warm Saturday in June, Elijah stood backstage at Carnegie Hall, adjusting the bow tie of his new suit. The fabric felt strange against his skin, too stiff and formal, but Ms. Rivera had insisted it was perfect for the occasion. "Stop fidgeting," she said now, smoothing his collar with hands that trembled slightly. "You look very handsome." Elijah gave her a nervous smile. "There are so many people out there, all of them excited to hear you play," she reminded him. "Just like at your audition for Juilliard's pre-college program last month. Remember how that went?" He nodded, the memory calming him slightly. The audition that had seemed so impossible just months ago had ended with the panel of judges offering him a full scholarship on the spot. Oliver Bryant, who had become both his teacher and fiercest advocate, had later told him it was unprecedented. "You're going to be amazing," Ms. Rivera continued, her voice catching. "I'm so proud of you, Elijah. So proud." Before he could respond, Professor Chen appeared, program notes in hand. 5 minutes, he said. Then, noticing Elijah's expression, he added more gently, "Nervous?" "A little," Elijah admitted. "Good. A touch of nerves keeps you sharp." Professor Chen winked. "Though between us, you have less reason to be nervous than any student I've ever taught. You were born for this. What if I mess up?" The question that had been haunting Elijah escaped before he could stop it. Professor Chen considered this seriously. "Then you'll recover and keep playing, and most people won't even notice. But you won't mess up, not where it counts." He tapped Elijah's chest. "The notes are just the framework. What matters is what you put into them." A stagehand appeared, gesturing that it was time. Professor Chen squeezed Elijah's shoulder and stepped back. "Show them who you are, young man." Taking a deep breath, Elijah walked onto the stage. The lights were brighter than he expected, making the audience a dark mass beyond the edge of the stage. He could make out a few familiar faces in the front rows, the Wilsons beaming with pride, Dr. Hargrove, her usual clipboard nowhere in sight, Oliver Bryant, whose rigorous teaching had transformed Elijah's raw talent into disciplined skill. And there, in the third row, Mrs. Abernathy, whose initial disgust had been replaced by genuine support. She had become a regular visitor at the Wilsons, bringing sheet music and stories from her own days as a music student. Her journey from prejudice to championship reminded Elijah daily of music's power to transform not just the player but the listener as well. The piano waited center stage, its lid raised to project the sound to the farthest corners of the hall. Elijah approached it with reverence, adjusted the bench, and sat down. The moment his fingers touched the keys, the familiar calm settled over him. This was where he belonged. He began with Bach, a prelude that Oliver had insisted was essential to developing proper technique. The piece was technically demanding, requiring precision and control that Elijah had worked for months to master. 6 months ago, he wouldn't have been able to play it. Now his fingers danced through the intricate patterns with confident ease. From Bach, he moved to Debussy, the impressionistic colors washing over the audience in waves of sound. Elijah closed his eyes, letting the music carry him through memories of rain on the shelter roof, of sunlight through dusty windows, of his mother's hands guiding his smaller ones across their neighbor's out-of-tune upright piano before everything fell apart. For his final piece, he played his own composition, not the one from the Westfield recital, but something new, something that spoke of both where he had been and where he was going. The audience leaned forward in their seats, caught in the spell of a young boy's journey from despair to hope, translated into sound that needed no words to touch the heart. When the final note faded, there was a moment of perfect silence. Then the hall erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, some wiping tears from their eyes, others shaking their heads in amazement. Elijah stood to take a bow, his heart pounding with a joy so intense it was almost painful. As he left the stage, Ms. Rivera was waiting, her face wet with proud tears. She hugged him tightly. "Your mother would have been so proud," she whispered. The thought brought unexpected tears to Elijah's eyes. In all the excitement of the past months, he had kept his grief carefully tucked away, focusing instead on the opportunities that had opened before him. But in this moment of triumph, her absence felt sharper somehow. "She used to sing me to sleep," he said quietly, "even in the hospital when she was too weak to sit up. She'd whisper the songs instead." Ms. Rivera held him closer. "She's still singing for you, Elijah. Every time you play." After the recital came a reception in one of Carnegie Hall's elegant rooms. People crowded around Elijah, offering congratulations, asking questions about his training, his future plans. Reporters from music magazines took photos and notes. A representative from a major record label slipped Oliver Bryant a business card. It was overwhelming, but also wonderful in a way Elijah couldn't quite articulate. These people really saw him not as a charity case or a curiosity, but as a musician worthy of respect. As the evening wound down, he found himself standing next to Dr. Hargrove, who was speaking with the dean of Juilliard's pre-college division. "We're fortunate to have discovered him when we did," Dr. Hargrove was saying. "His talent might have gone unnoticed for years otherwise," the dean nodded. "Talent like his is rare at any age. Combined with his work ethic and emotional maturity," he shook his head in wonder. "The sky's the limit." Elijah shifted uncomfortably, not used to being discussed as if he weren't present. Dr. Hargrove noticed and had the grace to look embarrassed. "Elijah," she said, including him in the conversation. "Dean Patterson was just saying how impressed he is with your progress." "Thank you, sir," Elijah said politely. "I have good teachers." "Indeed you do," the dean agreed. "But they all tell me the same thing, that you bring something to the music that can't be taught." Later, as the Wilsons drove him home, Elijah watched the city lights blur past the car window. So much had changed in 6 months. Sometimes he still woke up disoriented, expecting to hear the sounds of the shelter around him. Coughing, crying, the creak of metal cots as people turned in their sleep. Sometimes he still caught himself hoarding food, tucking apples or granola bars into his pockets out of old habit. But those moments were growing fewer. The new reality was beginning to feel more solid than the old one. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Mrs. Wilson asked, turning in her seat to look at him. Elijah smiled. "I was just thinking about everything that's happened. How different things are now." "Good different?" Mr. Wilson asked, catching his eye in the rearview mirror. "Mostly," Elijah said honestly, "but sometimes I think about the kids still at the shelter. There's this little girl, Zoe. She's really good at drawing, but nobody sees it because—" He trailed off, not sure how to express what he meant. "Because they're too busy seeing other things," Mrs. Wilson finished for him. "Like how people saw your old clothes and the smell instead of your music." Elijah nodded. "Exactly. I got lucky." Someone finally listened. "But what about all the other kids?" The car was quiet for a moment as the adults absorbed the weight of his question. Finally, Mr. Wilson spoke. "That's a big thought for someone your age," he said, "but an important one." "Maybe," Mrs. Wilson added carefully, "when you're older and have made your mark in the music world, you could start a foundation, something to help talented kids who don't have the resources they need." The idea took root in Elijah's mind immediately, feeling right in a way he couldn't explain. "I'd like that," he said softly. As they pulled into the driveway of the small house that had become his home, Elijah thought about the strange journey that had brought him here. From the shelter to Carnegie Hall in 6 months. From being the kid everyone wanted to get rid of to being the one everyone wanted to claim credit for discovering. Life could change so fast. That was both terrifying and wonderful. Inside, he went straight to the piano, drawn to it as always. His fingers found a melody without conscious thought. Something new. Something that spoke of gratitude and determination and the long road still ahead. He played softly, thinking of the applause still ringing in his ears, of Ms. Rivera's proud tears, of Professor Chen's unwavering belief in him. But mostly he thought of his mother, who had given him his first taste of music, who had always told him that beauty could be found in the darkest places if you were brave enough to look for it. And as the melody took shape beneath his fingers, Elijah Thomas, no longer the smelly kid from the shelter, but not quite comfortable with his new identity as a prodigy either. Found himself exactly where he belonged, balanced on that perfect edge between memory and possibility, between what was and what might be, the only place where true music lives.